Welcome to the SOB radio show, where we have fun, interesting guests, and hot topics. Each week, we offer insights into music, fashion, health, fitness, and humor. Do you have the perfect guest for us to interview? I want to know. Drop me a line on our Facebook page at Spunky Old Broad 1 or reach out to me on our website at spunkyoldbroad.com. And now, back to the show.
Hi, everybody. This is Gail Carson. And once again, I just want to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Spunky Old Broad. And then I want you to go to my website, spunkyoldbroad.com, where you're going to find my programs, our other radio shows, our store, and just a whole bunch of information. So hopefully, we also send out a newsletter every week that you might want to read. So hopefully you'll go there. But I have a guest today who is absolutely fantastic by the name of Grace Sammon. Listen to her background. She's an entrepreneur, an educator, a speaker, an author, and a storyteller. She has started and managed 2 for-profits and 2 not-for-profit companies, and for nearly 30 years, she and her team worked in the United States' toughest institutions, the American high school. Her passion focused on underserved large school systems and the importance of personalized learning and career education. She's worked in 32 states and with tribal nations, with small businesses, and with large federal agencies. Having written 3 books and numerous articles in the area of education, she is utilizing skills built up over decades as she reinvents herself with her debut novel, The Eves. The Eves is an intergenerational story about lives lived well and lives in transition. It's a novel that challenges each of us to ask who we want to be in the world, regardless of our age. Well, welcome, Grace. And I have to say we have a lot in common. My doctorate is in education. I don't know if you know that or not, but I was really part of the educational system, but not in high schools. I had my own chain of career schools. So welcome to the show, Grace.
Oh, Gail, thank you for having me. And I did indeed know you had a degree in education. It was one of the reasons I knew that we were going to have a great time this morning. So thanks again.
Well, you're welcome. And I want to talk to you about everything that you've done in your past and what you're doing now. You talk about being, a lot of things, educator, entrepreneur, writer, storyteller. How have those roles changed over time? And what's your message today? I would assume that the high schools of today are a wee bit different than the high schools that you taught in, although many of them are not open now because of the fact of the pandemic and so forth. But what are the changes that you've seen?
Oh, education has changed so much, and I think that we're in such a pivotal area. I used to say back 10 years ago, I was still very much enmeshed in high school improvement, high school reform across our country, and I knew that it had to change. I'm certainly sorry that it is changing as a result of a pandemic. But as our children change, as our learning techniques change, we had to somehow pivot to reach multiple ways of teaching and learning. So one of my key focuses in high schools was to create these massive high schools into smaller learning communities, schools within schools. Some people would recognize that maybe as a middle school model, but making schools more personal and then having a link to career focus. Not that we think kids in middle school or high school are really going to know what they want to be, but at least tie it to something that they think they might want to be. So we have some relevance in learning, because I think all of us learn best if it makes sense to us. We learn to cook and we learn math along the way. So it's that relevance, it's that change. But with your question of how it changes, I think that's a key theme of your show and certainly of my life. If we're present in the moment, we're changing every day. And I certainly have seen that in my career and in yours.
Well, it's true. And I do think that I'm not always sure that the changes that we see are for the positive, but I do agree that, having smaller classes and having a situation where you're having a much more interesting and more an impact with the kids that you're working with, it makes a big, big difference. So you wrote this novel, which is very different, the E's. And it has characters from 15 to 94. And there are women who are whole, who are broken in transition, and who believe they are done, and those that are just starting out. So I, of course, believe that, you can accomplish forever and ever and ever. So why did you craft your story this way? And are they interrelated? And how does this all play out?
I think I wrote the story because when I was in my late 50s, I really didn't know who I was, even though I am very authentic and very upfront. I was very tied to the role of daughter, the role of mother of my kids, the role of educator, the role of public speaker. And as I began to see those things change in my life, my parents were deceased. My kids were now adults. I wasn't traveling 200 days a year anymore. I really wrestled with that question of who am I now without those roles? So I created this scenario of, as you mentioned, the diverse age group. So I could kind of talk to my younger self, and I could have these older people who could continue to teach the main character who was just so totally broken. She has totally lost her way. And in crafting the story this way, I was thinking of people who, like myself, were really thinking I was aging out. And I used to think I was really smart and created that phrase, but I didn't. But I really felt I was aging out of all of my roles, and I didn't know who I was left with. So I created this story of how do you find your way. And in some ways, I found my own way through the writing. I've always written, and as you mentioned, it's my fourth book. But this was a different journey for me. It was a way of finding my way, expressing myself. And it also was written at a time where I then had the great gift of time to explore writing, to explore much more volunteering, which I think is a real hallmark of how I want to live my life. And it just gave me the time to do that. And in the release of the book, I again never anticipated releasing a novel in a pandemic, but it has given me huge gifts to connect with people, both on social media platforms and in interviews like your own, and then to hear back from readers that say, I'm 97 years old. Will there be another book like this in my lifetime? That's really
Wow, that's
powerful.
fascinating. That's fascinating. 97-year-olds writing you and saying, will there be another book? First of all, isn't it wonderful that a 97-year-old is reading your book? That's number one. Number two, that they're excited enough about where they're going and what's happening that they want another book. And it just goes to show you that it isn't your age that makes a difference. It's how you look at everything that makes a difference. So you discovered a lot about yourself as well as, I guess what your characters discovered.
Absolutely. And I steal a phrase, and I think many authors do this. We're basically authors are very good listeners and they are eavesdroppers. And I have a friend of mine who says he will not be done until they fold his hands in the box. And I love
Well,
that image.
it's interesting because they say that when you retire, I mean, if you retire with a plan, it's one thing. But when you retire with because you think everything wonderful is going to happen from there, that's when your health begins to deteriorate. So I think that your friend or whomever really is saying the right thing, and I do think it's okay to certainly make these shifts and these changes and different interests. And this is what I want to do now with my life. I mean, all of those things are great. One of the things that I'm dealing with right now is I've decided that my focus is living a life of legacy. It's not so much accomplishing anymore. It's a legacy. What am I leaving behind? And, that's a hard thing to come to terms with. So tell us a little bit about how these characters progressed and where you got them from and how they came about and so forth.
Well, I love, Gail, that you use that term, living a life of legacy, because the characters in the book are very, very determined to leave their mark on the land. And Jessica doesn't get that. She winds up telling their oral histories. And as she does that, she understands that concept of leaving that legacy. There's a scene in the book where the older women, so the group of what I call the oldies are 70 and above, and they decide to live in this sustainable community above the beautiful Calvert Cliffs of Maryland, right atop the Chesapeake Bay. And each year they do a harvest and they involve inner city kids who come out from Washington, D.C., and come down to this beautiful plot of land. And they harvest the land and they learn together and they learn from the older women. And at the end of the evening, all of the kids go into the barn with the older women and they dip their hands in paint and they put their handprints on the barn wall. And so there's this amazing image of all these colorful hands. And the women turn to them and they say, "It is so important for you to leave your mark on this land." And
Interesting.
and that plays out in several ways. And I do think that's a critical question. And we've certainly taught that and discussed that over and over again during this pandemic. What mark are we going to leave on this land? What legacy? There's a scene in the book where they talk about what would be written on their tombstone. What happens between the dash, the date of your death, and then that little dash between the date of your birth. They talk about it a lot as reach. What reach will we have into the future when our stories are told? So for me, it's leaving the stories, creating important conversations. You referenced that some of the families are whole and some of them are broken. I would love that my work, your work, is us about talking about our stories, leaving a legacy. And even if that is a legacy, and I don't mean to make this sound minimalized, but leaving a legacy of kindness. If somebody says the day I die, she was so kind. I'm happy with that. I love that they could point to my books or some of the volunteer work I've done with hospice or with guardian ad litem abused children. Those are ways that we leave an impact. Uh, I give a lot of credit to some of my thinking to Mitch Albom's The Five People You'll Meet in Heaven. And that was
Right, right.
such a great
Yeah.
book. And
Well,
who are those people?
it's interesting because I know, especially I have to say this about women, that sometimes we get to an age and we say, what did we really do? What kind of impact did we really have? Who did we really, touch? And what am I all about? And that's what kind of makes us spiral down, so to speak. And it very often happens when that magic age of 50 comes. I think, I talk about 50 being the new 30, et cetera, et cetera. But for women, when they hit that mark of 50, it kind of it psychologically has some kind of impact on them. So I think that we need to give ourselves credit where credit is due. Just bringing up a family, just dealing with even the younger women today. Think about this, Grace. You know, during this pandemic, I have been isolated for over a year now, but I don't have young children here. I don't have a spouse to worry about. I don't have a lot of issues I have issues, but I don't have a lot of issues that people deal with. Think about the people who are balancing work and school, virtual learning and having kids under feet all the time. And as much as you love your kids, sometimes they can be a pain. So, how on earth do you think this also is impacting our kids today who are not in school, who are at a very impressionable age, Is this going to have an impact as they age?
Oh, I worry about that, Gail. I really do. I worry about cultural divides too and economic divides. I'm very lucky. I'm married now to a fabulous spouse, and we have made it through this pandemic beautifully. But I watch my daughter, who has two small children, works full time, is married to my wonderful son in law, who contracted cancer during this pandemic. So to watch the beauty and grace and juggling act of my daughter's family, of how do you deal with a kindergartner who is now in virtual school, a 4-year-old who is in a pod of learning, dealing with chemo treatments, still having a job. Um, I think that balancing act is amazing for young people today. So I worry, my grandson seems to be flourishing and reading, and it's a delight. But what about the families with multiple kids, with multiple learning styles, with limited internet or limited resources? I really fear for where we're going to be down the road a bit.
Well, they say it's going to take a while for everybody to catch up, especially the ones who do not have access to internet and online learning, as well as some of the more well-to-do families. So it is going to be an issue. So when we talk about, all of these things, like aging and what the young people are going through today now, what is most surprising to you being the age that you are now and having the background that you have?
I think the thing that is most surprising is the whole influence and dance with social media. I really shunned it, to be quite honest, and didn't realize the impact. So if I was jealous of a younger self, I wish that I had understood that. I also think it's that wrestling still of where does this next step take me? I was on my morning walk with my neighbor this morning, and we were talking about having to keep up with technology. So that whole commitment, if you will, to not being done, to staying present, to continue to learn. Sometimes that's exhilarating and sometimes that's exhausting. And, you mentioned women and sort of self doubt. There are days, and I always want to temper this when I do interviews. There are days where I feel, wow, I wrote a novel, it's doing great. I'm gifted to be on various shows, and I'm all that and a slice of bread. And then there are days where I go, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And I think that that's okay. And I want listeners to know that as long as I have a friend of mine who says you can have a pity party, just set a timer. And I just want us to be able to say wherever we are today is okay. What are the options that we have? And what are we going to take advantage of to make those options happen? What legacy, if you will?
Well, that's true. I think having options is fantastic, and I think having options that please you are fantastic. And sometimes the options we have we don't want, but I do think it's important to have them. And it's interesting that you talk about technology, because I was thinking the other day. I do a lot of media consulting, so I consider myself not an expert, but someone who understands the industry. But I can tell you, every day, there are new things popping up. And they drive me crazy because, for instance, there's this new thing on Clubhouse. Everybody wants to talk on Clubhouse. And, oh, wow, I've got 50,000 people on Clubhouse now. And then there's a new thing, Voxer, and I keep getting every day, Jane Doe is on Voxer, connect, and I'm thinking, I don't want to do that all day long. And I have an app called WhatsApp, and I've got 4 different groups on that are not-for-profits and things like that I belong to. And they can spend 12 different messages saying nothing. And of course the phone dings, dings, dings every time there's a new message that comes in. So I think social media is important. I think social media gives us a knowledge, but I also think it can overtake your life. And it's just amazing how many people have done well on it, have made money on it, have these millions of followers on it, and yet, it can really take over your life. So, I think it's just something that you have to pay attention to. So we have about 5 minutes left in this segment, Grace. I want to ask you, did you always think of yourself as an entrepreneur? I mean, what were your career goals? How did they come to be? And, being an educator is not necessarily being an entrepreneur. So how did you blend the two?
It was by accident. I was what I call happily ever aftering. I was working at a university. I had two small children. I was married to a university professor. I had my degrees, and I thought I was pretty much happily ever aftering. And I served at a university, and in a university, you're either tenured or you serve at the pleasure of the president. And I was gone in a minute when a new vice president came in. And 3 months later, my husband decided he wanted a divorce. And I went from thinking I was all set to having absolutely no idea what I was going to do. And I answered a teeny tiny ad in the Washington Post back in the days when you answered ads in the Washington Post. And it said, educational consultant needed to create new nonprofit. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do, but I knew I needed a job. I knew I had education, and I knew I was committed to a world of nonprofits. And I got the interview, I got the job, and it just launched me on a 30-year career of creating companies. And it's funny, I think it wasn't really until later years that I could even say I am an entrepreneur, I am a risk taker, because that didn't feel organic to me at all. It was very much necessity was the mother of that invention.
It's interesting, and I talk about this when I counsel women, and that is, if you see an ad of some sort, or you are going for a particular job, and there are, let's say, 5 characteristics that they say this is what you need, and a woman has 4 of them, but not the 5th, she won't apply. But a man will look at the same 5 characteristics and may only have 2 and still apply. And I think it's a different way of looking at things and a different philosophy. And I commend you for answering that ad and for, taking and biting that bullet, because that not only was a culture shock for you in being let go by the university, which is, that's one of the things that, of course, I've never worked for anybody, Grace, so it's hard for me to say this, but I always said, first of all, I can't work for someone who asks me to do something stupid and then I don't want to do it. And then number 2, I never liked being told what to do, so I didn't want anyone telling me what to do. So, that was kind of an interesting thing too. But the point being that you're at the whim. When you're working for somebody, no matter whether you're a superstar or not, you're at the whim of somebody. And then the other thing is that you took a chance. You said, I know that I've got these particular qualities. I believe in myself. But you were hit a double whammy by your husband wanting a divorce. And I just wonder if that was kind of tied to being let go by the university. It's one thing when you're both employed by a university, it's very prestigious. And then all of a sudden you're not any longer. And I just wonder if that had something to do with it as well. But, you had a double whammy and you came out of it, which is fantastic. And that's the whole point of what we're talking about. And when we talk about, the spunky old broads, and we talk about SOB radio, which is what we're doing right now, it's people like you that give our listeners hope, that they go through these transitions in life. It is not always fair. It is not always what they want. but it does bring out the best in the people who are able to do this well. So for those of you who are listening, we're going to take a short break now, come back with our second part with Grace Sammon, and I hope you're listening to what she has to say, because she's someone who has reinvented herself, if you want to use those words. She has reinvented herself. She has become an author, an entrepreneur, someone who works with Native culture, who has created all kinds of new ideas in education. So stick with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes.